Hey everyone, welcome back to the Wild Health Podcast. We're a genetics-based precision medicine company that's exploring all the big questions around holistic health, wellness, and performance optimization. If you're tired of the traditional healthcare system and want to sign up as a member with us, head over to wildhealth.com. And if you're someone who's looking for a high-touch, all-inclusive concierge medical experience specifically designed for executives and high performers, check out our premium program at wildhealth.com/premium. Now let's get into it.
Hey Jay, how are you doing today?
Hey man, doing well.
I just want to welcome Dr. Jay Wiles to the Wild Health Podcast. I think you may have been on before, but if not, welcome.
Two times. This is my third go round. So third time's a charm.
Well, I'll keep your intro brief. You're an international speaker, scientist, clinician, you're influencer, subject matter expert, and authority on the interconnection between the human stress response and health, performance, and optimization. You're a clinical health and performance psychologist with a board certification in heart rate variability biofeedback, which is what I'm excited to talk about today. And maybe tell us a little bit more about what you do and your interest, just to get us rolling.
Yeah, I'm not a conventional psychologist. I always tell people that because I think when people hear of clinical psychology, they think of more the clinical side of things, right? So they'll think, oh, this is an individual who does, diagnostics, testing, assessment, therapy, kind of the traditional Freudian, like sit people on the couch and do processing. And that's obviously an outdated thing even for a clinical psychologist. But instead of kind of seeing clinical populations, I've always had an interest in how could we leverage information from the body, because I know that so much of people's emotional well-being and stress manifest in their body, and we can use it as almost like a warning sign detecting system. So I've always been fascinated with this approach of like, how can we quantify people's stress response? We quantify everything else, right? We have lab work for, anything related to our physiological health. I was like, well, can we do the same thing for mental health? And so when I got my start, which was with the Department of Veteran Affairs, I found out there was a way of doing that. And for me, it was just like mind blown because I had never really come across anything like that. And we'll have to remember, Trey, this was before the advent of like wearables, right? So there wasn't really, an Oura Ring or Apple Watch or Garmin Fitbit Whoop, and that wasn't a thing. So the way we were doing it was with like clinical hardware. So it was using like clinical grade EKG. But I just found it to be really fascinating. So I kind of just went down this rabbit trail of saying, like, how can we continue to better serve people from a mental, emotional stress perspective through the use of these quantifying kind of methods? But then also, can we use them more on the therapeutic side of things? So kind of less traditional clinical psychology, which is more talk therapy or psychotherapy. Could we use different approaches? Which is why I became so fascinated with biofeedback, both from a research perspective, but also a clinical perspective as well. So I always tell people my background is, yes, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I have that lens, but I also consider myself a clinical psychophysiologist, which is basically how can we leverage information, objective information from the body to direct therapeutics.
Yeah, and something I find interesting in all of this, in my work with you and my clients, I find it interesting for the really high performer, right? That has kind of suppressed the subjective feedback they're receiving on the stress side. They almost always know it's there, and they find that it comes out here and there eventually, kind of like boiling over, but they're not really tracking it subjectively on a day-to-day basis. And so I found this to be a highly valuable tool for them with regards to the objective measure there. So I find it very interesting. Well, let's get a little bit more granular and talk about what you're actually measuring. HRV is a buzzword. It's been around for quite a bit now in this space. But what is HRV? I think a lot of people know what the basics are, but let's go basic first, and then why is it considered an indicator of stress?
Yeah, I think that it's always a sensitive question for me because it's thrown around quite loosely, and might not the word or phrase heart rate variability, but kind of a definition of heart rate variability is thrown around quite loosely. And I think that there are so many advantages, nowadays to be able to track things like heart rate variability with any modern day wearable and do so in a pretty accurate way for the most part. I think that that's great on the one hand, but also it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because I think that a lot of the information out there has been misleading on how to use it and how to interpret it effectively. And a lot of times too, people are getting these wearables and they're tracking HRV and they have no idea what they're looking at. And they think, oh, this must be heart rate, or this must be some other metric that I could compare to other people. And it is stressful for them. So it's a mechanism for monitoring stress, but it's also a mechanism to kind of enhance people's stress, especially when they start doing this bit of social comparison with each other. So kind of put simply, heart rate variability is looking at the variance or the variability that is occurring between successive heartbeats. So I always tell people, the heart doesn't operate like a metronome. So people intuitively understand this idea of heart rate. So if you have a heart rate of 60 beats per minute, then that means that on average, your heart is beating once every single second, or within a cycle of 60 seconds. But the heartbeat's not really working like that. We actually know that there's these crazy fluctuations that are happening, or really should be happening, which means that the amount of time between heartbeats becomes very variable. And the primary kind of dictator of that, or mediator of that, is our breathing, but also too it's our internal and external environment and how well we're adapting to stress. So when we think about heart rate variability, I always tell people it's the single greatest non-invasive proxy for changes in the nervous system or changes in your stress response. And that's because we know that our body is made to, or should be, adapting to stress when we encounter it. And that means that we need our nervous system to kind of speed up when we encounter a stressor. So we call that sympathetic activation. We need that to happen, because otherwise, if the mountain lion jumps around the corner on a hike and we have no stress response, then we're probably going to just be like, hey there, kitty kitty, and stay there and probably die. And so our body has evolved to have this system to kind of speed it up, and all the systems are go, time to mobilize energy and get out of there to save our lives. We have that effectively, but we also need kind of the other branch of the nervous system to activate as well, our relaxation response, so that when things have calmed down, we're in an environment of safety, an environment of connection, then we need to conserve our energy. And that would be, what we call our parasympathetic nervous system. And so HRV is kind of a window. It's an insight as to how those two branches are operating. Are we seeing kind of more removal of our parasympathetic side and more activation of our stress response? Well, that's going to be indicative of a heart rate variability that might be suppressed, which means that we're having a harder time either adapting to stress, or we're in the midst of a stressor and all of our energy reserves are being kind of executed at that time to save our lives, essentially. And then we also can look at it as well as heart rate variability actually going in an increased direction. Is the trend going upward, meaning that we're restorative, we're repairing, we're in a state of more relaxation. So we just use HRV as a good mirror insight into kind of how well we are adapting or not adapting to stress. And obviously this can go for both physiological stress and psychological stress. So I always like to make that distinction. The processes are very similar and they're very interconnected, but we can use it again as a proxy for like physiological recovery. So how much are we physiologically being stressed, but also how much are we psychologically being stressed, and how well are we recovering from psychological stressors? So it's a bit of context that is needed in terms of how we're using the data, and then how we're allowing it to shape the roadmap for future behavior.
Awesome. I've got a ton of questions running through my mind that I think would be valuable to the listeners. I think maybe if we could give a just very elementary example of what a individual, say my HRV is. Let's just say my average walking around, relaxed, daytime HRV moves around somewhere between maybe like 40, 50, 60, something like that. If I am under psychological stress and that would cause my sympathetic nervous system to activate, we would expect to see HRV drop, correct? When do you actually become kind of concerned, I guess, with the change from my baseline? Maybe tell us a little bit about when it would be unhealthy to have a stress response that's prolonged or too pronounced.
Yeah, it's a valuable question because I think people kind of assume then, well, if I have a suppression of heart rate variability or it goes in a downward direction, then they assume that's an automatically a bad thing. And I tell people, no, not at all. That's your body actually engaging in the way that it should be engaging. So let's say, kind of for simplicity's sake, your average or your baseline is a 50. And I always tell people stability in heart rate variability is good. Like when we see it kind of maintaining stability, that means good resiliency. It's not just like, oh, I want it always to be quote unquote high. I actually want it to be stable as much as possible. If you encounter a daily stressor, let's say, you're working and all of a sudden you get like a really kind of like unfortunate email that's saying, you just lost, $100,000 out of your, 401k account. And you're like, what in the world? Like I've been saving forever for this thing. And you experience that kind of acute stressor, heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up, HRV gets suppressed. Well, that's your body responding to a stressor. And it's not something, it would just be the same thing as if I got up right now from my seat and I sprinted down the hallway and sprinted back, my body would respond naturally to that stressor. Now, from the sprint example, I do that, I come back, heart rate variability's dropped, HRV goes up. You would expect that after a few minutes of me sitting and relaxing, that would stabilize. I'd go back to normal. The problem with a lot of these psychological stressors is that you have that same impact as if you sprinted down the hallway, maybe not to the extent. Maybe my heart rate, during a stressor doesn't go up to 120 or so if I sprint down the hallway and back, but maybe, the psychological stressor has to go from 60 beats per minute up to like 85 or so, or 90. What happens though, is for a lot of the times when we experience these stressors, we don't have quick recovery. So basically the body gets into this state shift change and it stays there for too long of a duration. And that it's those compounding effects that are problematic. So let's say, you get that email, you lost $100,000 out of your 401k, your heart rate goes from 60 up to 85 or 90, and your HRV drops from 50 down to, let's say, 20. So it's reduced by, let's say 50 to 60%. Now, again, the short term, if that happens and then 10 minutes later it returns back to stable, not a big hit on the system. But if it stays that way and it's suppressed and continues to go down or stays lower, because your body is so amped up to handle this stressor that it perceives as a significant threat, because maybe it is a significant threat, maybe it's not. But in either way, if the body responds that way, well, we have to remember all of these other physiological systems that are kicking into high gear to help you mobilize energy when you really don't need it that much. So we can think about all these increases in blood glucose. We can think about the increases in cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine. These are needed to help us out within kind of that moment. But if they stay on, if it stays activated for an extended period of time, we know that this has detriment both to the mind and to the body. So again, this is kind of bringing it back to context, but also too, it's the duration. Like, are these things kind of kicking you out of this state of stability into a state of instability for an extended period of time? That's kind of the problem side of things. It's not just it's turned on and then turned off a little bit later. It's turned on and it stays on.
Right. Yeah. And I think that actually maybe brings me to my next question, because in that scenario, I think that's where biofeedback can be very useful, right? We all understand that we're going to have times in life that are more stressful, and sometimes those psychological stressors continue to stick with us. We either have ruminating thoughts or, anxiety related to that stressor. And so, whether we are able to subjectively register that, or if we think that we've moved past it and we're trying to suppress it, I think the body is kind of keeping score. And so maybe you could explain to us a little bit how in this scenario, biofeedback could be useful in that prolonged setting of suppression, or just in any real setting of kind of tracking it.
For sure. The one thing that tracking heart rate variability or wearables have gotten right is that it helps to enhance people's level of self-awareness as to their physiological recovery, psychological recovery through the proxy of heart rate variability. So they've done a really good job of saying like, hey, we're going to give you kind of insight if you track consistently on kind of how your nervous system is responding. What they haven't gotten nearly as right is, well, what do we do about it? Like, how do we actively engage in something that can better regulate your nervous system. And I want to be clear here that, so many people fall into this trap of thinking, I've got my HRV at said place, and therefore I need to make the baseline higher. And I think that couldn't be further from the truth. We do not have scientific evidence. There's nothing in the literature that suggests that HRV is some ultimate longevity biomarker. And therefore, like if you are at a certain range, you are in, a problematic health state. There are extenuating circumstances for that statement. However, in general, it is not seen to be a very good proxy for health and longevity as far as like where you fall. Now, where it can be helpful is learning the trends of where heart rate variability is. And this is where I think you can utilize. I think these wearables need to do a better job at the interpretation of this data, but you can look at trends. If you're educated and you learn the system, you can look at the trends. But again, the buck shouldn't stop there, because I always tell people that self-awareness without doing something about it, or data without like a roadmap for doing something about it, is essentially useless. And sometimes it can be very counterproductive, right? You can have all this information and the next thing you know, self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, I slept like crap, I didn't recover well, so therefore I've got the excuse to not go to the gym, or I've got the excuse to, sit around on the couch and just watch Netflix for the next 5 hours. It's like we can fall into these self-fulfilling prophecies based on data, which leads me to the next point, which is, okay, well then what should we do with that information when we see kind of this suppression of heart rate variability, either in real time or kind of based on trends? And I would say is that we have to implement tools for regulating the nervous system. We have to train our nervous system just like we train anything else, right? You wouldn't expect somebody who's a power lifter to set a record and go win on their next competition, and not actually train for it. Or, a marathoner to say, I'm going to go set my new PR and run this marathon, but you're really not going to train for it. I'm just going to kind of show up one day, and next thing I know, I'm going to qualify for the Boston Marathon. Not going to happen. We have to put in the time and effort. The nervous system is no different. I think that we sometimes just kind of don't see the connection there. But we have to train resiliency within the nervous system in order to have a resilient nervous system. Because, the nervous system is going to do what it can to help stabilize and maintain homeostasis. But at some point, these things crack. There are chinks in the armor, if you will. Same thing with blood pressure, right? Blood pressure is going to try to maintain stability as much as it can. But then, over time, due to lifestyle factors and whatever it may be, we start to see the thermostat change a little bit and adapt to its environment. But we know that while it's trying to maintain homeostasis at 150 over, 100, probably not great for us. Actually, we know it's not great. It's not a problem. It's not a good thing for us. The same thing happens with the nervous system. It starts to kind of set its own thermostat. So what do? We have to train. And the way we train is we can do it through a number of things, right? Anything that's activating the parasympathetic branch of your nervous system, so it's activating your relaxation response, can be effective. But what we've actually found, Trey, in the literature is that heart rate variability biofeedback is one of the most easily accessible tools that we can use that has been found in evidence to actually move the needle substantially in teaching you how to regulate your nervous system. I tell people this always comes down to control. How can we snap our fingers at our nervous system, tell it to do what we want it to do, and it listens? Initially, it may be a little bit stubborn when you try to control your nervous system because it's been kind of conditioned to do its own thing, be in high alert system, kind of being set to kind of protect. Whereas we have to teach it to kind of relinquish its own control and listen to our control. So, listeners may be saying, okay, well, how do we do that? And what does this mean? And what HRV biofeedback is, it's really utilizing heart rate variability as a guide. It's information that shows us kind of where our nervous system is moving at any given time. And the way to affect change is quite simply, it's changing our breathing. It's changing the mechanics of our breathing, but it's also changing the pace of our breathing. And we know that we can change inherently our physiological system, so our cardiovascular, respiratory, and then autonomic nervous system through changes in breathing. So heart rate variability biofeedback is a way of visualizing those changes in your physiology in real time by measuring heart rate variability, changing the pacing of your breathing, and then seeing the effective change by checking heart rate variability. So it's check, do the therapeutic, and then check again, or check in real time. You can see it happening. So I teach people these tools, and we utilize different technologies to measure heart rate variability in real time, change breathing according to kind of their optimal rate. And we can talk about how we find their optimal rate. And then we look to see, well, is the nervous system actively shifting? And that can help to condition a new behavior, because a lot of people intuitively understand nowadays that, like, yeah, breathing is good. Like, we should engage in these practices. But I think the power that biofeedback has is that it gives you the objective evidence that this thing is working, right? It's if you have the evidence that your nervous system is actually engaging in a state shift, you can see it within your data, you can see the physiology, then we're much more likely as humans to adopt that new behavior because we have the evidence that it's working. Whereas with some of these other practices, they're really effective, and we have the research to say mindfulness meditation is really effective. Breathing without biofeedback is really effective. But then I always ask the question of, well, then how often do you do it? Like, is it something that you're actually readily engaging in? And most people are like, well, I know it's good for me, but I'm not doing it. And a lot of it's because, like, I don't know that it's working. Like, maybe I feel more relaxed. HRV Biofeedback gives you both the, oh, yeah, I know it's working because I feel relaxed, but I also see it objectively in my data. So sorry, I didn't mean to kind of drone on, but I wanted to set the stage as to why this was an important skill. And it's something that I think can be a really beneficial practice for people who need that objective reinforcement, let's call it accountability, in their practice of breathing.
That's awesome. No, I appreciate you elaborating on that. And I want to actually, before we, I'll come back to the determination and the optimal rate and some of the like specific tools that you think would be beneficial to like implement in practice. But you brought something up around kind of the nervous system thermostat getting changed over time, and I actually find that really interesting. I would assume, actually, I'm theorizing here, but pretty certain that the hunter-gatherers didn't really have as much of a problem. They saw a tiger and they had an immediate stress response, and they either survived or they didn't. But when they got back to camp and they were safe and eating and having communion with their fellow hunter and gatherers, they probably were pretty relaxed and happy that they were alive. I think that the current environment that we live in, there's no tiger for most people, but the amount of inputs that we get that can be deemed by our nervous system and mind as stressful are pretty consistent, right? We wake up in the morning, we check our email, we get pinged with at least 4 or 5 stressors in there, depending on how busy you are. And then as you continue on, right, through the day, there's another stressor. Then you look at your phone and you're kind of getting ramped up because of that exciting video and you're getting a dopamine hit. So I think that our environment right now is designed in a way that we don't really have much of a parasympathetic time or a recovery time. And especially if you're not really focusing on doing that. There are some individuals out there that have a really nice morning meditation routine and breath work, and they have breaks throughout the day. I think for most of the population, that's not necessarily the case. And as you mentioned, I think biofeedback provides a really useful tool for us to be able to say, okay, look at this data. Either, you're not spending any time in recovery, you're bouncing from one activity to the next. And then when you do implement X, Y, or Z, here's the result of being able to move back and forth fluidly into those different states. So, I don't know, maybe what's your take on the environment today leading to that?
Oh, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more here, Trey. What I have seen so often are that people are just lacking a lot of the times in the self-awareness as to how some of these, we'll call them like innocuous events to them, believe, and I'm putting air quotes in here on the video, what appears to be innocuous is actually affecting their nervous system way more than they would ever even anticipate. And we see this in the things that you mentioned before, whether it's doom scrolling, on social media or, news networks, or it's, emails or phone calls, or like all of the stimulation that they're getting, both kind of on the quote unquote good side of stimulation, dopamine hits, but also on the poor side too, where it's like they're getting these, we'll call them like micro stressors, if you will, throughout the day. I think people don't really understand and can't even comprehend the compounding effect that these things have. That it's like, well, it feels like maybe it's not as much of a hit when you're experiencing it, but then when you look back in retrospect, because hindsight's 20/20, right? Is that like, oh gosh, yeah, I see where that, and that were affecting me and my stress response and my nervous system. And I always say that this leads down one of two paths for human being. We have enough evidence to demonstrate that one of these two things will happen if we don't manage our nervous system and our stress response. Humans either explode or they implode. That's the two paths that we get with compounding stress that's not managed well. We're either going to fly off the cuff and explode at someone else, or we're going to implode and we're going to socially isolate, and maybe we experience depression. That's the two paths. But if we're actively regulating our nervous system through something like biofeedback, and again, I don't want to say that that's the only strategy. I've just found it to be such a valuable evidence-based strategy for a lot of people to keep them accountable. I think that if we're engaging in those things, then we have a lot less likely of, the potential of kind of falling down the explode, implode route, which is why I think it's imperative that people, if we're doing all this other stuff for our physical well-being, we have to put our emotional health and well-being and our stress response kind of in the forefront as well. Because if we don't and we leave it behind, I think number one, we're leaving a lot at the table, but also we're not going to reap nearly as much of the other benefits of the other things that we're doing in our changes of sleep and nutrition and exercise and, kind of everything else that we have kind of within those health and wellness categories.
Yeah, I think you do bring up a great point as well, with regards to it's not the only way for folks to be able to manage and modulate their stress response. I mean, over the years I've had really high stress jobs and I didn't practice breath work at the time. Finding ways to modulate stress, being outdoors, exercising, a lot of times exercising and with the intensity that's high enough to force me to relax afterwards, which can also be a little bit of a double-edged sword there. But, I think that for folks out there listening, there are other ways and there are successful ways to do this. But I think I agree with you on the front of I found this strategy to lead me at least towards probably, at this point in my life, the best state of resilience on stress that I've experienced. And, it comes with other tools that make you more self-aware, right? Whenever you start to engage with this, you can kind of understand your meditation practice a little bit better and start to see the benefits, not just spiritually, but from a physiologic standpoint there. So
one other thing to add to, Trey, because I think this is really important, right? Because this kind of comes back to this notion of a lot of people think that, or they understand, there's a lot of research out there regarding mindfulness practices or meditative practices, but a lot of people, when they try to do it, it feels too cognitive. It feels like, man, I just cannot get outside of my head. It's very difficult for people. I always tell people that a great way to kind of, as an entry point into those types of practices, something like meditation, is to, instead of trying to change the mind with the mind, try to change the mind with the body and utilize biofeedback as a way to kind of almost like prime the body and to prime the mind in order to do meditation. So a lot of people have found a benefit in doing something like biofeedback as a great entry point or tool into these mindfulness practices. And I tell people, I love it. I love the combination of both of those, right? So that's kind of really like my go-to is I do a bit of like mindfulness with biofeedback. But initially, I had to do biofeedback before I did mindfulness because I needed something almost to like prime the system to get me out of my head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And over time, I found the combination of the two to just be so amazingly beneficial, right? Where I'm not only practicing resonance breath, which I think we're going to talk about, but I'm also doing visualizations, right? And introspection during that. And I feel that that's as evidenced by my HRV, I've worn a polar strap and collected this data, but also my subjective experience is where I really start to find benefit. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about how you can determine maybe the optimal rate of breathing on a one-off instance, or is that something that's static? What does that look like whenever you're evaluating that?
Yeah, this is a great question. So it might be helpful for me to kind of explain what the term resonance means, because if people haven't heard that term, that may sound a little bit odd. Resonance is this idea. So anything in the body that vibrates. We think about so many. This is kind of like found all throughout nature. This is not some esoteric thing. This is deeply rooted in science. is that organisms, we vibrate. And I'm not talking about like energy vibrations. I think a lot of people may kind of go to that. That's kind of a topic for a different discussion. This is more of the topic of like when our cardiovascular system and our vascular tree is expanding and contracting, it does so at a rate, a vibratory rate. And we know that within our system, our cardiovascular system, we have a mechanism called the baroreflex response. This is essentially the body's way of managing homeostasis or stability of blood pressure. What does that mean? So as heart rate goes up, we know that actually blood pressure will go down. These stretch receptors within the aortic arch of the heart, but also in the carotid sinus of the neck, they sense this heart rate increase. And so therefore, in order to maintain blood pressure so it doesn't go too high, it actually stimulates kind of a negative feedback loop to lower blood pressure. And then vice versa, if heart rate gets too low, then actually our body's baroreflex mechanism will increase our overall blood pressure. So there's one system, but then there's the other system, which is our respiratory cycle. And we know that human adults generally breathe around 14 to 16 breaths per minute. Some people a little bit lower, some people a little bit higher, especially women are typically a little bit higher, men are typically a little bit lower. Now, our heart rate, or I should say our blood pressure mechanism actually oscillates. So again, its frequency is at a much lower rate than our breathing rate. And so we breathe really quickly, typically at normal, and our blood pressure mechanism is a lot slower. Nothing inherently wrong with that. However, what we found, and researchers out of Rutgers University, Dr. Paul Lair, has found that actually as we lower our breathing rate, we can actually get it closer to the same rate as our blood pressure mechanism, the baroreflex response. And we all have, human adults and children as well, have a rate of breathing that can actually align those two systems, your breathing rate cycle and your blood pressure regulation cycle. And when we align them basically 1-to-1 with one another, we call that resonance or a resonance rate. And we know that this can have significant impact on vagal tonality. In other words, the activation of our vagus nerve is by aligning those two rates. And we can significantly increase our parasympathetic or relaxation response. So there's a technique or a protocol referred to as the resonance frequency protocol, which is finding, well, what is your optimal rate of breathing to help stimulate that response, that resonance response in the body that we know is so good for our mental and physical recovery and well-being and enhancing stress resiliency. So you can go through this phase of breathing cycles where you breathe at 6.5 breaths per minute, 6, 5.5, 5, and 4.5 for 2 minutes each. And we can see through heart rate variability metrics which ones are amplified the most at the different cycles. That's kind of the traditional published way of doing it. And to your point, you were saying, well, is this kind of a fixed thing? And what the researchers found is that, yeah, it's a pretty fixed thing for the most part. And I say for the most part because newer evidence is actually suggesting that it may not be an exact pinpointed like 5.5 or 6.5, but maybe it's kind of somewhere in between and can fluctuate a little bit. So it's a little bit more adaptive depending on the context and kind of where your body is. Now, would you have someone who one day we find is 6.5 breaths per minute and the next we find them down at 4.5? No, we don't typically see that. But could we find that someone's maybe at like 6.2 and now, today they're at 6.34 or something like that? Yeah, we can. But that takes a lot more sophisticated ways of monitoring and strategizing on how to find those things. And not to put any type of kind of marketing push now, but in my new company, Ohm, our intention is to find that for you and hold you at that adaptive spot when we can. But if you're using other traditional methods, then you might have to go through, like I mentioned, again, that series of testing that's going to put you at one of those kind of like half point spots, 6.5, 5.5, 4, 4.5. Not 4, it's too low. 4.5 is actually the lowest people go. So there are ways of doing that. And then once we find that resonance rate through all of those data points, then what we want to do is train at that rate. So we want to put the body into that state as basically as frequently as we can. So having like either a dedicated time to do it or repeated times throughout the day of doing it. We basically just want to condition the nervous system to be able to get into that space as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So I tell people the whole idea behind biofeedback, find your resonance rate, practice at that rate, so that when you do practice at a controlled environment and you condition the body to adapt to your breathing, Then when you're in an uncontrolled environment and you don't have your biofeedback device, but you're in the middle of traffic in New York City and someone cuts you off and you get really tense, that you can automatically become your own biofeedback mechanism, and you can begin breathing at that rate to regulate your nervous system. So that was probably a bit long-winded compared to kind of what you asked initially, but hopefully that provides the explanation.
No, I think you nailed it. I think that's what well, as you were speaking, I thought, this would be a great time to maybe outline what it could look like. And you got there. I mean, like the practice could be different from individual to individual, right? Where you're going to find benefit from implementing something like resonance breath. It could be during an acute stressor, right? Between, as you step out of a stressful meeting and you're getting ready to go into a new environment, right? For clinicians listening, as you come out of a stressful visit with a patient, you have to go in and see another one, pausing for a few seconds, practicing resonance breath. Not only, I think, does biofeedback help me as an individual understand, to like actually recognize that stressor is there and say, okay, yeah, my HRV is probably plummeting right now. I can feel the norepinephrine and epinephrine and cortisol like flowing through my blood. I can visualize it, and I can start to downregulate and reach a state of homeostasis again by pausing right here in this moment and practicing some resonance breath at my given rate. But also too, like starting the day with it, right? So it may look different from individual to individual. You may start your day with a practice of breathing and mindfulness, and then, have a couple times set throughout the day where you just go to that, right? You have a scheduled time, put it in your calendar, it's afternoon and then before bed, and a downregulation type routine to help you get into a deep sleep state. So there's a bunch of different ways that it could be implemented that could be more effective for one individual to the next. I think you mentioned what you're working on now. I'm interested, for wild health patients, for the general population, kind of how could they go about accessing this in general, or you specifically?
Yeah. So, there's a lot of technologies out there right now. So if someone's like, well, I want to start implementing, biofeedback immediately, there's a lot of really great vetted, products on the market that have been there. So, my last company, Hanu HRV, has done a really great job in developing, a lot of resonance frequency protocols within, their application. The Institute of Heart Math has done one that's been, well received by a lot of people, which is kind of a phone-based application for biofeedback. There's some other companies, Elite HRV kind of has it built into theirs as well. It tends not to be as personalized, if you will. However, it can still give you biofeedback as a source of training. My new company now, which is called OHM, OHM. So if people want to check it out, it's OHM, ohm.health, ohm.health. What we're trying to do is kind of get people away from their phone, because so many people say, well, I don't associate my phone with a place of relaxation. It's kind of like chaotic. So we wanted to develop something that people could develop a ritual around and could be in their environments and is a beautiful statement, timeless piece for them. So we actually created, I can't say too much just yet, but go to ohm.health and follow us and stay in tune for the updates. But essentially it's a piece of hardware. We call it a resonance lamp. And essentially this resonance lamp is intended to be within your environment. You pick up, we'll call it an object that begins reading your physiology immediately. It's connected to the lamp, and the lamp paces you to your resonance rate. We find it through an algorithm and pace you there. So it's just kind of like an intuitive, like quick thing. You don't have to deal with your phone. It's in your environment. It's really pretty. So we'll have to have me back on to talk further about it at some point. But that's something that kind of we're developing, for the future, and should be out, in the next probably 8 months or so. So there's a wide variety of ways of doing it. So if you want, something that's not connected to the phone, then you have, something like Ohm that we're developing, or there's obviously like phone-based applications that you can use as well that can be really effective and get you started, almost immediately. I also kind of do this level of training with people. So I've worked a long time kind of in this space, with a wide array of individuals from, Fortune 500 executives to professional athletes to the general individual who's just like, I'm really stressed and I need some help, or, I'm really anxious and I need some help. So, actually I offer, through Wild Health, I offer, my services, both to, the premium clients, but also to the ones who just have, a regular membership who are like, hey, I want to go see somebody who can really help me to better understand, my stress response and how to include biofeedback as a practice and help me to interpret and analyze the data, which can be really confusing for people. So, you can go over to my website, which is thrive-wellness.com, and you can check out kind of some of the stuff that we do there. We're revamping the website completely, and we'll have a landing page for Wild Health here soon. But also, too, if you're just like, hey, I want some more information, like I want to work with, Dr. J, just email us info@thrive-wellness.com. That's info@thrive-wellness.com. And I'd love to set up a time to consult with you, and then we can, talk about what it's like to work together and can help you with the biofeedback, the data analytics for HRV, and really teach you how to monitor and train your nervous system to be the most resilient it's ever been.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Jay. And I'm, as we roll out the ability for our Wild Health patients to work with you and continue to get that, when you get the landing page ready and all that, I understand the struggle of internet development is always ongoing, trying to keep everything up to date, and so many places
100%.
I can understand that. But as we get it ready, if you're a Wild Health patient, you want to talk with your health coach or physician about it, we're going to be, able to refer you over to CJ. And, we've had a lot of success, you and I, working together with clients, and it's pretty impactful. A lot of our executive clients that we share have found success, and I think, it doesn't have to be the Fortune 500 executive to have a stressful life, right?
100%.
We all have our own versions of stress, and I'm grateful for the work you do. Yeah, man.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. And you're right. I always say that the services that I provide, even though I've worked with those types of individuals, are not just dedicated to those individuals. This is something that I want to make accessible to everybody, because everybody could benefit from this. Whether you're the single mom trying to balance, your life at work and your 3 kids, or if you are the Fortune 500 CEO who's like managing kind of, all these funds, and you're, traveling all the time. It doesn't matter kind of who you are on that spectrum. Like, we want to develop, technologies with my company, but also provide services to anyone that could benefit from enhancing their resiliency to stress and improve their emotional mental health. And that's all of us. I mean, I know I'm biased, but I think the market's pretty big there, because we all could benefit from that level of training.
Oh man, well, it's good talking with you, Jay. I'm gonna go ahead and call it quits here. I think we covered everything that we wanted to, and I look forward to having you back on to learn more about your new product.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me on. Excited for our next chat.
Thanks so much for listening to the Wild Health Podcast. If you want more daily health education, be sure to follow us on Instagram, which is filled with health optimization how-tos, grocery shopping lists, guided breathwork posts, myth debunking, and so much more. You can find us at Wild Health MD on Instagram.